social and emotional learning is hegemonic miseducation, right? Social and emotional learning is really popular right now as all this sort of trauma-informed teaching is taking off. Behavioral education is sort of taking off. But I argue that it is hegemonic miseducation and that students deserve humanization instead. And so when I think about this concept of hegemony, Hegemony, I think about this metaphor of an elephant that Paulo Coelho, the author of The Alchemist, once wrote about when, so I think about this elephant that Paulo Coelho writes about. So this idea of hegemony was first constructed by Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who argued that there was two stages of hegemony. The first was coercion, and the second phase of hegemony is consent. Coercion is violent force. We could put on that elephant thing. Coercion is violent force. It's the military. It's the prison system. It's state-sanctioned violence. And once you sort of get people to submit to your violence, the second phase of hegemony is consent. It's when the oppressed become complicit in their own oppression, right? And so if you watch the film The Matrix, which was written by the Wachowski brothers, who are both trans women now, the Wachowski sisters, there's a scene where Neo, Keanu Reeves, asks Lawrence Fishburne, Morpheus, what is the Matrix? The Matrix is hegemony. And Lawrence Fishburne, Morpheus, told Keanu Reeves, Neo, that the Matrix is the world that's pulled over our eyes to blind us from the truth. Well, that's one way to think about hegemony. And so if you think about this Paulo Coelho metaphor of the elephant, we know that you can't just climb a wild elephant, ride on its back comfortably, because it is a free elephant in its natural habitat, liberated, free roaming species who knows freedom and will resist its domination. So circus trainers know this, and instead they look to season or break or condition elephants while they're babies, so that these elephants, when grown, can serve the needs of human handlers. So they'll tie a rope around a baby elephant's neck, tie it to a stake hammered into a ground, and this baby elephant will try to break free, hour after hour, day after day, testing the limits of the rope, testing the limits of its bondage, for like a year or so later, until a year or so later, it'll submit to the idea that it cannot break free from bondage. And so now this fast forward, and you take this same elephant who is now an adult, who has the power to tear a tree out the ground from its roots, but it will have convinced itself through the conditioning, breaking, and seasoning of its handlers that it did not have the power to break free. And so you can tie a rope around the same elephant's neck, tie that rope to a broom hanging, like leaning against the wall, and it will have convinced itself that it can't break free from a bondage that is actually very weak. And that is hegemony. Next slide, please. There's a lot of animations. And so we could connect this concept of hegemony to miseducation as I cite a Philippine nationalist historian named Renato Constantino, who wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Filipino, which is a clear allusion to the miseducation, to the 1933 classic written by Carter G. Woodson called The Miseducation of the Negro. And so we know from the Treaty of Paris 1898 that the US bought Guam, the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico from Spain for $20 million. Spain was losing hold of these 4 colonies. And so it was like a short sale. The US came in, put very little money down and stole or conquered these 4 countries. They call it annexed. But the US were resistant, like the elephant, to their domination. And so to quell that resistance, the US sent 300 teachers called Thomasites to hope to cultivate in the Filipino people a benevolent assimilation. It was mostly white women, but one of those Thomasites was Carter G. Woodson. And he saw that the Thomasites taught in a way that was incongruent with the needs of the colonial subjects in the Philippines. And so Constantino's illusion was an expression of cross-national, cross-racial solidarity. Hit click, please. And in the Miseducation of the Filipino, we could hit click. Renato Constantino says, go back. And then click. He says that the most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. The most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. So even in a time of war, him and Carter G. Woodson argue that the most effective way of wow, I'm on.
Yeah, I was a little thing to click for panelist video. There you go.
Hi, everyone. So maybe I should control the slides. The most effective way to control people is to control how they think, right? And so another way to think about that is many social, sort of materialist thinkers like Marx and Engels. They argue that our consciousness, right, how we think, is based on the material and social conditions in our lives. And to think about the material conditions of our lives historically, we can look to a 4-year period of human society between 1347 and 1351 during the time of the bubonic plague. Dominant narratives sometimes refer to this era as the Black Plague, but descendants of African people had nothing to do with it. And so during this period, 50 to 70% of the European population died. And so what do you think that could suggest? Hit the chat if you know. That 50 to 70% of the European population died within this 4-year period. What that suggests is also that people were living in poverty. This was feudal Europe. It was feudal society, and people were part of the land. People came with the land. And if you watch Game of Thrones, if Cersei's, kingdom stole another kingdom, then the people who were part of that kingdom were a part of the kingdom they stole. And so they're owned by the monarchy. And so Europe didn't have a thriving economy. The large majority of European population at the time lived in poverty. And so of this phenomenon even came a song called Ring Around the Rosies. Remember that song? Ring around the posies, pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Well, a rosie is the malodorous rash that was developed on the skin of bubonic plague sufferers, right? And so it was the stench of death that people said you can smell from continents away, that families were needing to conceal with pockets full of posy flowers. And so it's interesting, right? Because in 10th grade history, they called it world history. but there's an after-colon title called Western Civilization, as though the history of the world began in Europe. And we know that's not true. But that's part of the dominant European narrative. The more common, the more accurate truth is that people throughout the world had sophisticated agriculture, plumbing, healthcare systems that provided protections against the plague, while Europe was barely learning how to make fire. And so even Christopher Columbus's priest, upon landing in Mexico City, Bartolome de las Casas, said that Mexico City looked like a city built on a lake. That's how sophisticated the agricultural system was in Mexico City. And so when your society is 50 to 70, when your society is poor and 50 to 70% of the population dies, Europe sought to save itself through international voyages and began the process of colonization, right? And so remember, Dr. Annie requested this sort of radical version of my lectures. And it does come from a place of love. I am not a pit bull barking at you. I am a pit bull barking with you. And so Europe sought to save itself from mass poverty by funding these international voyages and starting this process of colonization. And as a result, all these thriving so-called third world communities became impoverished because they eventually became dispossessed of their material resources by what Cedric Robinson, a Black Marxist from Oakland, called racial capitalism. And so the Eurocentric narrative was that the people throughout the world were savages, that they had, and it was Europe's duty to save these savages throughout the world, that somehow, people of color throughout the world were backwards, right? They even justified their colonization through a concept called the white man's burden, right? A poem written by Rudyard Kipling, where they tried to act like Europe had an abundance of humanity, an abundance of spirituality, an abundance of culture to bestow upon these pagan savages in Asia, the Americas, Africa, the Polynesian Islands, Australia, and elsewhere. And so there was a bank robber named Willie Sutton during the Great Depression who was caught. And when he was caught, they asked him, why do you rob banks? And Willie Sutton said, well, that's where the money is. And so to save itself from poverty, Europe went to where the resources were. And Frantz Fanon argues that industrial Europe and European wealth is literally the creation of the third world, that the wealth which smothers Europe then and now is that which was stolen from racialized, underdeveloped people of color throughout the world. And American historian Robin Kelly argues that this racial capitalism was dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. And we could extend that to heteropatriarchy, ableism, and other forms of intersecting oppressions and state-sanctioned violence. And so when this European wealth got its startup money from the stealing of resources from people throughout the world, and they used genocide, biological warfare, right? And we know that Native American indigenous communities exist today, and we should fully support Native autonomy and land back movements. But a large majority of indigenous people were targets of smallpox, of biological warfare, which led to this manifest destiny, sea to shining sea, where many of us have settler privilege because masses of indigenous people were massacred, and we occupy this land guilt-free because of the erasure of Native people and Native narratives that make us comfortable when we're not reminded of who has been dispossessed and who has been displaced. all of it to build white wealth. And so the United States is a predator state. You know, we talk about predatory lending. Well, the US is a predator state, born off of the genocide of indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, and the feudal exploitations of Asians and other people throughout the world. And so when we sort of wonder why the imposed poverty, the wealth inequality, and economic exploitation in targeted, racialized Black and brown communities in the US is the way it is today, it is because Black, indigenous, brown, and other people of color have been dispossessed by European colonization and US imperialism. And so we have been dispossessed of our material resources, and this military assault has been extended to our belief systems, our ways of knowing, and our linguistic practices that are very different to the hegemony of English that we mostly communicate with today. And so when you're broke, when people have been dispossessed because they've been alienated from resources that are inherently theirs, where do you think you go? Right? When you think about people you know, when you think about yourself, when you're broke, when you're hungry and you need to eat, where do you go? We go to the resource where the resources are. And so when people have been alienated from resources that are inherently theirs, they have to go to where the resources are. And so many students in our schools and in our communities are descendants of dispossessed and displaced people. And many of us collectively, we might have individuals who have been able to make it, but many of us collectively are poor not because of our spending habits, not because we maladaptively cope and spend our money on comfort food or self-medicate as a way to manage dealing with the day-to-day stresses of everyday life. No, when you look at the conditions of surviving poor, working class, Black, indigenous, brown, and other communities of color, our conditions have come because we have been dispossessed of material resources, belief systems, ways of knowing, and language practices that ought to be ours. And the communities that are the beneficiaries of this stealing have wealth, freedom, resources, quality schooling, health, and everything that communities of color do not have. And this criminal social system is creating the social forces that determine how much of the stolen resources we can access today. And it is not in the interest of American schooling or American society born off of this oppression to provide an education for humanization that would teach multiply marginalized people and historically oppressed communities this truth, right? And this is sort of what is referred to in sociology as push and pull factors. You dispossess a people, you push them towards a society that pulls them with the resources that it has stolen from historically dominated people. And so while many of us, people of color, have settler privilege, different from descendants of enslaved Africans who were forced here, right? Some of us maybe had a quote unquote choice, but we were pushed here. But the same colonial forces that was responsible for what Saidiya Hartman refers to as the afterlife of slavery, or what Wayne Yang has referred to as the post-colonial ghetto, are the same colonial forces that have dispossessed us in our homelands back home. And if you are uncomfortable, I want you to just ask, Bree Pickauer and Rick Ayers, because I am not a racist. I have white friends. And so when we think about hegemony in this context, author of Black feminist thought, Patricia Hill Collins, argues that hegemony absorbs and therefore depoliticizes oppressed groups' dissent, meaning that a hegemonic miseducation teaches historically colonized people not to resist the colonial oppression that they find themselves in today. It makes us complicit in our oppression. And so in this context, we have the dehumanization of schooling. And so this is sort of the upside down triangle, also known as sort of the consent theory of power. And in the dehumanization of schooling, we're force-fed a curriculum that's not written by us, but by people who are privileged, mostly written by white people about white people. And so you'll see that in 5th grade, 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds are asked to do social studies through this textbook where they're studying about wolves and butterflies and sequoia trees. Given workbooks about Miss Lucy Calkin's approach to writing, very contextualized and race evasive. Science that's also race evasive. Would you know, shows us, I forgot what kind of plants, flowers these were, with, you know, snow-capped mountains and clouds, as though we don't deserve scientific literacy that prevents us from some of the toxins that cause us all types of compromised health. Then you have history books, right? Taught to 4th and 5th graders, that's title is making 13 colonies, right? Justifying the making of 13 colonies, the massacre that it takes to displace, dispossess, and destroy people to establish the United States, right? And to establish this dominant narrative, if you see the bottom of the triangle, of so-called first Americans. And so this is the dehumanization of schooling. And the dehumanization of schooling will have us learn about ourselves based on the experiences that white people are having. About what, you know, so we'll learn about all the great struggles that, you know, white communities are experiencing, and we'll become empathetic to you know, all these experiences that white folks are having. Will be empathetic of the experiences and the humanity of white people. And this is how our emotional development is shaped, by the perspective that is at odds with the history and dignity of oppressed people. And so we never learn how to cry about ourselves or to learn about experiences of romance through our own reality. It's always about the reality of our oppressors. And so we're indoctrinated with this myth of meritocracy that manipulates the masses into believing that if we assimilate, if we deculturalize, if we conform to the social irrelevance of miseducation, then we could advance in society. And policies like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top presumes that we actually need to go where schooling is taking us. And so as a result, we experience ourselves, our communities, and communities experiencing life similar to us. We experience ourselves as a negative. And so this curriculum is hostile. It negates our existence, and we don't have an explanation for this reality. And so the explanation that this educational system, this dehumanization of schooling gives us, is that we are responsible for our own suffering. That for our failure to regurgitate the hegemonic miseducation of schooling and its standardized testing, we fail. And because of those failing grades, we are responsible for our own failure, our own oppression, and our own suffering. And on top of that, the treatment that, you know, BIPOC people get in schools is too often obscene and vicious, because schools serving targeted and economically exploited communities are nothing but bastions of racial hatred. And so as a result, we're taught to see ourselves and people like us through the eyes of our oppressor. African American and communication studies scholar Molifi Asante refers to this as cultural decenteredness. Social work scholar Jerome Scheel refers to this as historical deprivation. It's also referred by sociocultural psychologist Mark Tappan as internalized oppression. And so when we start seeing ourselves from a deficit point of view, we start seeing others who experience life like us from the same perspective. And we see them see us, see ourselves from a deficit point of view. And we are mad that people recognize in us an internalized oppression. And so we displace our anger on people who were positioned to compete for a limited set of resources with. And that is systemic divide and conquer when we're positioned to fight for and compete for a limited set of resources. And this is also referred to by medical scholar Paul Farmer as structural violence, by James Garabino as social toxicity. And Bruce Perry will say that this leads to a hyperactive stress response system, also known as the amygdala, which doesn't know the difference between a real or imagined threat and is responsible for a fight, flight, freeze, and flocking mechanisms. And this then leads us to only have the humanity of heteronormative, middle and upper class white masculinity, able-bodied masculinity as the model of humanity that our notions of success is defined by. And so the only way we can be successful is if we model the humanity of our oppressor, what Paulo Freire has referred to as sub-oppression, what critical theorists has called a false consciousness. Counseling psychologists, colleagues of mine, Leila Perez, Christine Ye, they refer to this as assimilation as a coping strategy. Psychopathologist Frantz Fanon wrote a book about this called Black Skin, White Mask. Indigenous studies scholar Glenn Coulthard wrote about this in terms of red skin, white masks. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about this as double consciousness, and Gloria Anzaldúa talked about this as a mestiza double consciousness. And so it's sort of in this what I say that, and it's a piece I wrote with Stephanie Cariaga that was published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, where we argue that students deserve humanization instead. And so I'll skip this, right? So I basically say that in this slide that social and emotional learning is hegemonic miseducation because it does not look to address the colonial social conditions that is responsible for our suffering in the first place. And instead I say, we need a humanizing education. And so author again of Black feminist thought, Patricia Hill Collins, argues that humanizing education taps into our ways of knowing to foster our humanity as fully human subjects, to what Paulo Freire says leads to an education where we struggle to recover our lost or stolen humanity, right? So what does it mean to foster our humanity as fully human subjects, to recover our lost humanity as colonial subjects in dehumanizing American schooling? And so for me, we argue that when we think about humanization, we argue that it is built on knowledge of self, right? Learning to understand yourself and the world from your own point of view, in your own image, in your own voice, and in your own interest. Critical race theory has referred to this as counter storytelling and counter narratives. Neurobiologist Daniel Siegel at UCLA refers to this as a coherent narrative. And Cornel West and Jeff Duncan Andrade have referred to this as Socratic sensibilities, citing Socrates that said, An unexamined life is not worth living. And Malcolm X, who then says, an examined life is painful. But going through that process of understanding ourselves on our own terms and in our own interest provides us a knowledge and love of self, which then leads to understanding the stories of people who experience life just like us. And we start understanding that what we thought were differences amongst people in our own communities are people who can share stories of struggle against a common social system and intersecting systems of oppression. And when we rethink these deficit perspectives we've been taught about our own communities that justify our subjugation of one another, we then instead listen to the experiences that each of us have and start understanding one another through the lens that people would like to be seen through. And that helps us develop a political clarity, build community, and unites us on the common side and the right side of history, which is solidarity. And then we have, and so solidarity is political clarity. It is community. It is a common purpose. And so this should lead to self-determination. When we use what we read, what we write, what we study to benefit the communities and the people we love. This is, and self-determination is the highest form of what Jeff Duncan Andrade refers to as critical hope. It is the highest, self-determination is the highest form of what Sean Ginwright refers to as radical healing and thriving. And so it might feel strange that I use this case study of Tupac Shakur to illustrate an exemplar of an education for humanization. But from a cultural studies point of view, his life is worth examining because it helps us understand the historical foundations and political dynamics of contemporary culture. And so in this picture, you see that Tupac was, I kept an image of Tupac above my clock because I felt like he always told us what time it was. And so in his song, So Many Tears, he says that back in elementary, I thrived on misery. Left me alone, I grew up amongst a dying breed. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I put that thug life tatted on my chest. So from a mental health point of view, let's look at that, right? He says that back in elementary, right, I thrived on misery, right? My mental and emotional health was compromised by the imposed poverty, racism, sexism, and state-sanctioned violence that me and my community experienced. You left us alone. You didn't know how to serve our needs effectively. So we had to grow up amongst other young people experiencing life just like me. Inside our head, we couldn't find a place to rest. And he says, until I got that thug life tatted on my chest. Thug life is an acronym for the hate you give little infants fades everybody, right? Inside my head, I couldn't find a place to rest until I externalized this dominant narrative that I internalized. I was able to connect it to these historical and social contexts that helped me understand that my experiences were similar to the experiences of so many young people like me, right? That this thug life provided me a counter narrative, a coherent narrative, a Socratic sensibility that connected me with others, right? The hate you give little infants fucks everybody. And so the thug life movement that he created prior to dying at age 26, Malcolm X was still in jail at age 26. The thug life movement he was looking to create was to get gangbangers across the country to unite and to turn their attention to state-sanctioned violence and police brutality so that they can defend themselves from the vicious attacks of unmerited killing by police on Black people. And he died in 96, and you know that killing has intensified in Black communities. And he was trying to unite gang members to defend themselves, to stop anti-Black death. And so when we think about an education for humanization in this context, we have to understand that Tupac had knowledge of self, had solidarity with other Black people experiencing life just like him. And he defined success based on using their resources, their consciousness, their energy, and their resistance against a social system that was at odds with the history and dignity of their people. And so he learned this. What is this? So we think about this tattoo, right? And he used poetic license because it didn't rhyme to say, inside my mind, I couldn't find a place to rest until I got that thug life tatted on my abdomen. And so he learned this consciousness from his mother, a founding member of the New Jersey Black Panther Party and leader of the local New Jersey chapter. Afeni Shakur was his mother. His stepfather was Mutulu Shakur, who is well known for helping to heal thousands of heroin addicts through the use of acupuncture. His godmother, very popular Asada Shakur, who was his godmother, and his godfather was Geronimo Pratt, who spent decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And so Tupac's consciousness was cultivated in the resistance to anti-Black oppression. And in many ways is one of many examples of an education for humanization built on teaching young people, built on the importance of teaching young people knowledge of self, solidarity, and self-determination. And so I close my lecture by citing Native American psychologist at the University of Michigan, Joseph Gahn, who argued that in the health sciences, that we need a great deal more of the kinds of professional health, mental health services that do not yet exist to more effectively serve the needs of multiply marginalized people who have yet to find a cultural match, from counselors to help them with their mental health. And so as educators, I argue similarly that we need a great deal more of the kinds of pedagogies that also do not yet exist. And so for us to engage in this type of education for humanization, I also like to cite Native American scholar Eduardo Duran, who wrote a book called Healing the Soul Wound, where he cited a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, who constructed this notion of a wounded healer, which Eduardo Duran later called a wounded soul healer. And the argument is essentially that if counselors are to be more effective with serving the needs of their clients, that they needed to heal from the psychological stress and trauma of their own lives. Because if counselors did not heal from the toxic or psychological stress and trauma in their life, that they would be engaging with their clients in a process of transference, where you are indirectly and unconsciously teaching your clients that the most effective way to deal with their stress is through learned helplessness, right? If your way of dealing with stress and trauma is to avoid it, then you'll be counseling your clients in a way that teaches them learned helplessness as well. And they will not be in a position to more effectively transform their stress or trauma. And so from an anti-oppressive point of view versus a race-evasive point of view, if we're teachers who are trying to teach students social and emotional health and well-being that is race-evasive and does not account for how colonial history is present in the moment, all we'll be teaching students to do is maladapt and maladjust to the colonial hegemony that they find themselves in today. And instead, we as educators need to join the masses throughout the world who are resisting US imperialism, who are resisting legacies of colonialism, who are tapping into their community cultural wealth, who is tapping into their intergenerational wisdom, who is tapping into their legacies of brilliance and problem-posing education to find ways to transform the social oppression that leads to the social trauma to begin with. And unless we learn how to do that for ourselves, internally, interpersonally, ideologically, and institutionally and systemically, then we will be teaching our students that the best way to deal with the intersecting systems of oppression that they are faced with is to avoid it. We will be teaching our students learned helplessness. But if we have learned how to disrupt, internalize interpersonal, ideological, and institutional colonial hegemony, then we can use what we've used in our own personal, community, and organizational life in our pedagogy by implementing those lessons into our pedagogical methods so that young people, or so that students can learn how to then apply what we teach them into their own lives to disrupt colonial hegemony and heal from the toxic contempt of colonial miseducation long after we have taught them to do so, and they'll do it for themselves. And that is essentially the argument that I make. That social and emotional learning can still reproduce dehumanization, but fulfilling the aims of humanization, knowledge of self, solidarity, and self-determination will easily fulfill the basement level goals of social and emotional learning. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate you, Cam, and for everything you shared. It was definitely all love. And I definitely don't think it's too much for the community here in Chico that's present with us to handle. And if it is, it's something they need to learn to handle. So I appreciate for everything you've shared, and I'm going to turn it over to Lemmy.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you. I'm gonna take some questions. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A just yet that we can answer, but I'm gonna ask anyone to put a question in the Q&A if you have one. And I'm also getting a survey link that I'm going to put in the chat in case people are leaving, they can hopefully fill out the survey for us. So just one moment, I will add that to the chat. Type in your questions into the Q&A if you have one. We had one question about anti-racism, kind of the relationship between the talk and anti-racism. And I think you answered that throughout the talk, but if you wanted to.
From an anti-colonial point of view, racism, sexism, heteronormativity, ableism. Okay, so from an at least from the school of thought I come from, the primary contradiction facing multiply marginalized people in the context of the US, the primary contradiction, the main issue oppressing us is colonization. That the main issue facing people racialized as people of color, ethnic people in the US is the fact that we've been dispossessed from resources, dispossessed and alienated from resources, ways of knowing, belief systems, and language practices that are inherently ours. And racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and other markers of oppression are simply vehicles to keep us further alienated from resources stolen from us. And we are not going to address the real issue is colonization. And if we can't solve for racism, sexism, heteronormativity, ableism at all, then we will never find humanization or the humanization needed in order to struggle for the redistribution of resources, ways of knowing, belief systems stolen from us. And so racism is simply a small aspect of colonization.